W.E.B Dubois. Nationalism or socialism, militancy or liberal integration, assimilation or emigration. The Afro-American freedom struggle has forever been bogged down in categorizing, pigeonholing, and indiscriminate labeling. The record of W.E.B Dubois is conclusive testimony to the fact that this has been unnecessary, that a dynamic mixture of goals, programs, and ends has been possible. Himself one of the most labeled and misunderstood, Du Bois, at one time or another in his long life, championed causes that were indicative of integration, nationalism, and socialism. To understand the political philosophy of this man, one has to go back to his youth, to the formative years of his before the turn of the century. Raised in Massachusetts, he was isolated from the Negro world and socially at odds with the white world around him. He went to Fisk University in 1888 for college training and an opportunity to discover his own people. He had a summer teaching job in rural Tennessee, which brought him in contact with the black majority, the farming poor. He approached these people with an aloofness of an outsider and also with a desire to find roots and a sense of belonging. He saw beneath the surface suffering and unhappiness and looked instead at the essential worth and value of Afro-Americans, at the righteousness of their hopes and strivings. Du Bois came to believe that, quote, justice lies with the lowest, with the plight of the lowest man, the plight of the black man. As a 25-year-old graduate student, he would write in his private diary that he would soon move out into the world at large and work for the rise of the Negro people, taking for granted that their best development means the best development of the world, or as he expressed it in later years, quote, belief in humanity is a belief in colored men. This inspiration of his was the basis of his thesis written in 1898 that, quote, the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of man in Asia, Africa, America, and the islands of the sea. Subsequent writings would build this thesis to the stature of an ideology of color. Du Bois has consistently favored programs with future possibilities over programs of immediate benefit. At the turn of the century, he was a young professor just embarking on a 10-year project of sociological research, which would be known as the Atlanta University Publications on Race. He hoped his studies would aid scholars and political activists alike in devising a way ahead for the Negro, then suffering the worst of Ku Klux Klan terror, defranchisement, and restriction of civil liberties. At the turn of the century, Du Bois envisioned the development of a talented tenth, an intellectual elite which would lead the race in an eventual fight for full citizenship. For the time being, the education and training of future leaders would be achieved through existing segregated facilities. That is, Du Bois would create power within segregated Negro society in order to eventually eliminate segregation. The famous battle of Du Bois with Booker T. Washington was not really over Washington's condoning segregation. It was that Washington's program left the Negro politically powerless and hence socially and economically inferior. Justice for the black man demanded full equality. The moral issue was not the evil of Negroes acting alone with other Negroes, it was inequality. The Niagara movement, sponsored by Du Bois in 1905, was a black-only organization. It was dissolved and replaced by the NAACP, not because it was morally wrong, but because it had no source of funds, and its supporters among Negroes were too few for it to go alone. Du Bois presented many of his avant-garde views through his lifetime with a rhetoric of a careful and considerate logician. His thoroughly intellectualized presentations rarely attracted the immediate enthusiasm of the masses or the proselytizers of the masses. It usually took a decade or two. He was virtually alone as a Negro when he joined the Socialist Party in 1903, and it could be argued that he was 20 years ahead of his time when he endorsed the Democrat Woodrow Wilson for president in 1912. He gave as his reasons at that time the signs of a new Democratic Party-based working-class movement in northern cities, which, coupled with the emergence of a new labor movement, would make possible black and white labor unity. He did not go into details about how this unity would be achieved, but he did say in 1912, "We are willing to risk a trial." He later regretted gambling on the Virginia-born Wilson. The Du Bois initiative in the Pan-African Congress of 1919 has been hailed as a radical and far-sighted call for the end of colonialism. It was more far-sighted than radical. Describing his plans for the Congress, Du Bois noted that they had in them, quote, nothing spectacular or revolutionary. Quote, if in decades or a century they resulted in such world organization of black men as would oppose a united front to Europeans' aggression, that certainly would not have been beyond my dream. What I wanted to do was to sit down hand in hand with colored groups and across the council table to learn of each other our condition, our aspirations, our chance for concerted thought and action. Out of this there might come not race war and opposition, but broader cooperation with the white rulers of the world and a chance for peaceful and accelerated development of black folk." End quote. To fulfill its goal, the Pan-African Congress movement had to work through available channels, which were in 1919 quite limited. Even to have a Congress then was a progressive step and an achievement. Hounded from one hotel to another, the delegates were fearful of an American government intervention, of American officials pressuring the French into banning the Congress altogether. Conceived in haste, with delegates assembled on the spot, the Pan-African Congress in 1919 was nonetheless an impressive assembly. The 57 delegates represented American Negroes, West Indians, and various parts of Africa. They drew up a set of proposed amendments to the League of Nations Charter. Their final draft called for the creation of a civil rights plank, the abolition of servitude, the guarantee of African participation in colonial government, and the setting aside of former German African territories as a trust of the League of Nations. The mandate system of the League incorporated much of the latter demand. When Du Bois returned from France in 1919, he was probably the single most important American Negro militant. He was widely known not only for his writings and teaching, but also for his oratory. He had just returned from abroad when he went to Washington, D.C. to be guest speaker at the monthly Bethel Literary Society of a leading D.C. church. He was rarely averse to such engagements when time permitted. His introduction by fellow Pan-African delegate W.H. Jernigan were followed by a 5-minute ovation, after which Du Bois spoke, as described in the Washington Bee, quote, with the earnestness of a man who is conscious of the responsibility which is his in helping the race to make its way against an organized opposition of the white world. In reverent tones, the Bee implied Du Bois to be something of a mass leader. This he never was, although in 1919 he was certainly an individual with status and prestige among the masses. And concerning status and prestige, Du Bois had, in 1919, a rising competitor in Marcus Garvey. The two men disliked each other intensely, and in the long struggle between them there appears good justification for the explanation of personal jealousy as the prime cause of their mutual animosity. In general, the Du Bois-Garvey feud can be boiled down to partly ideological causes, partly a problem of mutual jealousy, and partly the result of Garvey's inability to accept criticism, coupled with the Du Bois penchant to play the gadfly and critic. Du Bois first took on Garvey in 1920. The year before that, he had been embroiled with Booker T. Washington's successor, Emmett Scott, and the year before that, the AFL had been the object of the Du Bois wrath. Du Bois had declared on the AFL, quote, in the present union movement as represented by the American Federation of Labor, there is absolutely no hope of justice for an American of Negro descent. Indictments of AFL discrimination continued throughout the between the wars period. But this was not a sign Du Bois was anti-union, and neither was he anti-nationalist because of derogatory remarks he made about Garvey. The verbal brawl between Du Bois and Garvey was not foreordained or inevitable. In 1915, Du Bois had traveled to Jamaica and was hosted with honor by the then Jamaica-based UNIA of Garvey. Even during the hostile years of the early 20s, Du Bois managed to find value in certain of Garvey's plans, quote, the main lines of which were perfectly feasible. Garvey Garvey was interpreted by Du Bois as arguing that, quote, American Negroes can, by accumulating and administering their own capital, organize industry, join the black centers of the South Atlantic by commercial enterprise, and in this way ultimately redeem Africa. To Du Bois, this was feasible. The general goals of the Garvey movement were one thing. The personality and actions of its leader were quite another. In this area, Du Bois lost his objective decorum. In one crisis editorial, Garvey was tabbed a, quote, little, fat, black man, ugly, but with intelligent eyes and a big head. In another editorial, the indignant editor sputtered, Marcus Garvey is without doubt the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and the world. He is either a lunatic or a traitor. In addition to the personality clash, Du Bois opposed Garvey's flirtation with the Ku Klux Klan, the Back to Africa scheme, the business proceedings of the Black Star Line, animosity of Garvey to the labor movement, and last but not least, the Jamaicans' disliking for light-skinned Negroes, a group of which Du Bois was a member. Du Bois himself moved increasingly into a nationalistic position in the 1930s. His emotion toward Garvey was then replaced by a detached observation. The leadership qualities of the Jamaican were a most remembered feature in a biographical sketch written by Du Bois in 1940. The Garvey movement, as described in 1940, was a, quote, grandiose and bombastic scheme, but it was sincere and had some practical features, and Garvey proved not only an astonishing popular leader, but a master of propaganda. Within a few years, news of his movement, of his promises and plans, reached Europe and Asia and penetrated every corner of Africa. Du Bois could appreciate the successful dissemination of a worthy idea. He evaluated his editing of the NAACP magazine The Crisis as the work of a capable, quote, propagandist, end quote. The Garvey method of propaganda seemed to affect more people. Du Bois had entered the Garvey era of 1919 with a tight connection to the gambit of NAACP liberalism. Denouncing lynchings and fighting legal battles was then thought to be avant-garde militancy. By 1930, Du Bois had become disillusioned with the achievements of the NAACP and also discouraged with the prospects of meaningful help from any white American, either liberal or left-wing. With the coming of the Depression, the reservations about America became a dominant theme of his writing and action. Of course, the nationalistic tendency in Du Bois had been present back at the turn of the century in his color line thesis. And in 1925, in an article for Elaine Locke's New Negro Anthology, Du Bois made an explicit reiteration of the color line thesis. He surmised it as valid then as it had been a quarter century earlier. He gave some examples. One involved labor strikes then occurring in South Africa. The white workers were engaged in bitter class struggle with the capitalist exploiters. For what end? For the right to exclude native South Africans from all skilled jobs in the mine industry of that country. The Bantu were forced to appeal to the imperial English government for assistance from the oppressor, the white laborer. Another example concerned the Congo and the socialist foreign minister of Belgium, who was well-intentioned toward the Congolese but inept at doing anything about his country's imperialism. The Du Bois novel Dark Princess, written in 1928, contained a strident anti-white pro-color emphasis, particularly in a scene depicting the civilized leaders of the Afro-Asian world who were meeting to discuss the fate of the decadent Western world, which was described as collapsing in an orgy of materialistic debauchery. The Afro-Asian leaders of the day, Asian aristocrats, Arab sultans, and traditional African chieftains, discussed at length the days ahead when they would bring to the world culture, grace, sensuality, respect for elders, and true civilization. And as for Du Bois, the nationalism of the 30s, it was in large part an expression of frustration directed at white laborers and their leftist allies. America seemed unaware that no matter how many whites became unemployed and on relief, Negroes retained twice the percentage out of work and on the dole. Numerous crisis articles documented this fact. In the face of this emergency, whites offered little to the Negro and concentrated on saving themselves. Du Bois was led to express the view, common to Garveyism, that the American white majority had definite gains to be made through racist exploitation. To socialist and communist arguments that racism was caused by ignorance, Du Bois replied, quote, "The white American laborers are not fools, and with few exceptions, the more intelligent they are, the higher they rise, the more efficient they become, the more determined they are to keep Negroes under their heels. It is intelligent white labor that today keeps Negroes out of the trades, refuses them decent homes to live in, and helps nullify their vote." He concluded caustically, "Whatever ideals white labor today strives for in America, it would surrender nearly every one before it would recognize the Negro as a man," declared Du Bois in a Crisis editorial of 1931. Throughout the history of the Negro in America, white labor has been the black man's enemy, his oppressor, his murderer. Mobs, riots, and the discrimination of trade unions have been used to kill, harass, and starve black men. White laborers have formed the backbone of the Ku Klux Klan and have furnished hands and ropes to lynch 3,560 Negroes since 1882, end quote. Skepticism of the white laborer was a recurring theme in his major historical work, Black Reconstruction, written in 1934. Black and white unity in Reconstruction was seen as a noble attempt, but one which failed not only due to capitalist manipulation and racist demagogy, but also because of the decisions of white labor. Du Bois recounts how the labor movement prior to the Civil War was involved in racist struggles to gain monetary rewards by excluding Negro competition, both slave competition and free competition. It is significant that while writers such as Philip Foner have emphasized the class consciousness of the German immigrant workers, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction describes these German immigrants as an isolated minority of antebellum labor, not reflective of American labor tradition. The northern labor movement after the war, as described in Black Reconstruction, on the whole, fails of a concerted effort to oppose racism of the South, and the southern white, when pressed to the extreme in the late 1870s, as described in Black Reconstruction, chooses to sell out the Negro in the hope of gaining some small status in a capitalist New South of, by, and for white people. According to Du Bois, the white laborer in Reconstruction chose short-run gains at the expense of the difficult struggle for long-term benefits through unity with blacks. A similar view of Reconstruction was carried in Du Bois' more recent work, Ordeal of Mansart. As for liberalism and the NAACP, quote, "By 1930, I had become convinced that the basic policies and ideals of the association must be modified and changed." Du Bois explained that in a world where economic dislocation had become so great as in ours, a mere appeal on the basis of old liberalism, a mere appeal to justice and further effort at legal decision was missing the essential need. I did not believe that a further prolongation of looking for salvation from whites was feasible. The NAACP reliance on white philanthropy, according to Du Bois, was in effect a surrender of necessary independence of action. In the crisis, in speeches, and in private conferences with NAACP officials, Du Bois pressed for a shift from the legal approach to one of economic action. The action Du Bois had in mind would seek to provide economic self-defense. And the actions described by Du Bois in the 1930s were generally identical to programs promoted by Stokely Carmichael and other black power theorists today. Du Bois would use the power of the already segregated Negro society to build for the elimination of that segregation. He called for consumer-producer cooperatives, the creation of Negro trade unions to watchdog white trade unions, the bringing of cooperative methods into existing Negro businesses, the use of boycotts and picket lines to force job openings for Negroes, the pooling of available black capital for political and economic use, the increased consciousness of the need for race unity which would build black power, and broadening of economic and social ties with Africa. The crisis was especially open to reports of Afro-American cooperatives and cases of race unity. Leaders of the NAACP criticized Du Bois for what they considered a negative attitude and an adoption of a defeatist Booker T. Washington philosophy. They accused Du Bois of being a segregationist. Consequently, the editor of the Crisis resigned his post in the summer of 1934. The Du Bois programs were proposed not only out of a negative desperation, but also out of a positive belief that the Negro should concentrate on saving himself because he was more worth saving than the white. In one of his last issues as editor of the Crisis, Du Bois wrote, "In the hearts of black laborers alone, therefore, lie those ideals of democracy and in politics and industry in which may in time make the workers of the world effective dictators of civilization." The idea of cooperatives had been with Du Bois for many years. He had initiated a short-lived cooperative league in 1919. For the 1930s, he sought to tie black consumer cooperatives with the White National Cooperatives Association, and he saw a possibility of Negro wholesale cooperatives in tobacco and cotton, and going beyond the usual idea of cooperatives, Du Bois called for a program to, quote, socialize race professional activities. Quote, hospitals can be as common as churches and used to far better advantage. And the legal profession could be socialized, quote, instead of being as it is now, a defense of property and of antisocial aggregation of wealth, become defense of the young, poor, ignorant, and careless. Banking could be arranged in cooperative style. This would, quote, eliminate the millionaire and even the rich Negro. It would put the Negro lawyer on a salary, which would be modest as American salaries go, and yet sufficient for a life under modern standards of decency and enjoyment, and it would eliminate also the pauper and the industrial derelict, end quote. In his autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, written in 1941, Du Bois carried the cooperative theme to a unity with Africa, identifying Afro-American culture with aspects of African society. He noted, quote, in the African communal group, ties of family and blood, of mother and child, of group relationship made the group leadership strong. In the case of Negro Americans, there are sources of strength in common memories, horrors, and experiences. Here, in subtle but real ways, the communalism of the African clan can be transferred to the American Negro group. At the 1932 NAACP convention, Du Bois urged closer ties with Africa. He told the convention, "We must rearrange our program. We have got to realize that the solution of the race problem in America is going to lie outside of America, that the present problems of race in America, Africa, and other Americas are of primary and pressing interest to the Negro race in the United States." Oh, how similar this is, one might note, to Black Power today. Fervent opposition to the American Communist Party was the cause of some of the Du Bois nationalism in the 1930s. Criticism of the party began in earnest with the communist NAACP battle over who would carry the defense of the Scottsboro Boys, the 9 young Alabamans accused of raping 2 white prostitutes. Du Bois favored the NAACP as defense over the party, and the party labeled him as one of the arch-race misleaders, and he in turn pegged the leaders of American communism, quote, men of pitiable mental equipment. The feud with the communists seems to have influenced his trend to nationalism, because it was in arguing with the party that he made some of his most caustic condemnations of white working-class racism. He conceded that dictatorship of the proletariat was well and good and probably inevitable, but as for a dictatorship of the white American proletariat, he wanted no part of it. His opposition to the left in the 30s did not mean he had ceased to believe in socialism. Rather, he was opposing what he considered to be a mistaken emphasis in the then powerful communist movement. During the McCarthy era, when leftists were under attack, Du Bois would come to their defense. When Du Bois retired to Atlanta University in 1934, many thought the 66-year-old veteran was retiring from politics for good. But during World War II, he returned to the NAACP in the position of Director of Special Research, a post which he described as, quote, specifically for the purpose of concentrating on study of colonial peoples and peoples of Negro descent throughout the world, and to revive the Pan-African Congresses. In 1948, after a personality clash with Walter White, he left the NAACP once more, this time to become director of the communist-led Council on African Affairs. The council was then under attack from government red-hunting investigators, and the Du Bois acceptance of leadership was the first of a series of moves by him designed to lend his respected position to left causes then under attack. He became an official in the distribution of the Stockholm Peace Petition and suffered the indignity of arrest and trial under the Smith Act for his activities in behalf of world peace. While waiting for trial in 1950, he came to the aid of the Progressive Party by running for U.S. Senator in New York. The elections were a debacle for the declining left, and Du Bois shared the poor showing at the polls. His trial ended in victory over the government, and with its end, with the end of the trial, so ended the political activity of Du Bois in America. He had isolated himself by that time from the Negro leadership group, and the white left had been defeated. When Martin Luther King began the Civil Rights Revolution in Montgomery, Du Bois commented coolly that King had a noble vision, but his chance of success was slim. Some 10 years before that, Du Bois had appeared more hopeful back in 1946. Then he had addressed an assembly of South Carolina Negro youth and prophesied that in the years ahead there was coming to Dixie a chance for young people to lift again the banner of humanity, quote, and build in the world a culture led by black folk and joined in by peoples of all colors and all races. The South was to be the firing line, not simply, quote, for the emancipation of the American Negro, but for the emancipation of the colored races and for the emancipation of the white slaves of modern capitalist monopoly. In his final years, Du Bois became both a citizen of Ghana and moved to Africa, and also became a member of the American Communist Party. Both the joining of the Communist International after he was 90 years old and the taking of African citizenship were suggestive of a future struggle where the rights of man would be led by a worldwide socialism based and projected from within the third world, at the time, hopefully, Ghana, where Du Bois died just before the March on Washington in 1963. And a final word is in order here on the Du Bois Clubs of America today. Really, they ought to change their name. It is an insult to Negro Americans to have a merely Marxist organization steal the name of a vibrant third world spokesman who was incidentally a red in his later life, but who was for 93 years a black